So, without any further ado, let's kick off with the first panel, which is on national communism and the Purges. And as Mike has just mentioned, there are only going to be a couple of papers because of Jeff's absence. First presentation is by Professor Daina Bleiere, the Latvian Institute of History. Professor Bleiere is a researcher at the Institute of History of Latvia and the University of Latvia. From 2005 to 2018, she was an associate professor at the Riga Stradins University in the Faculty of European Studies. She has published extensively on the history of Soviet Latvia, including the Sovietization process, the formation and development of the nomenclatura, and social and economic policy. A paper presented at this conference is part of the state research program Letonica, Fostering a Latvian and European Society, and the Archaeology of Independence towards a new conceptual perspective on national resistance in Latvia. So, Professor Bleiere, the floor is yours.
It's very unfortunate that Geoffrey Swain is ill and he couldn't attend. I hope that this paper is the first paper would give some kind of background and explain many things which also need to be explained, but perhaps could not be explained in 20 minutes. I should say that history of Latvian Komsomol after the Second World War is rather under research, and one of very few works, valuable works in this regard, is Geoffrey Swain's article, which was published in Europe Asia Studies in 2012. And in this article, Geoffrey Swain gave some suggestions which are important in connection with problem of national communism and with Latvian Komsomol nomenclatura. And one suggestion is that the first one is that Latvian Komsomol started to grow. Latvians started to join Komsomol after March 25, 1949 deportations. It was fear, not political education and so on, but fear which enhanced this process. What is interesting, if we analyze biographies of Latvian Komsomol functionaries, most part of them also joined Komsomol after in 1949 or later. Of course, there was some kind of core of ideologically committed Komsomol members who made their careers in Komsomol in 1950s, but this pool was not very big. And the other suggestion which was made by Geoffrey Swain was that Latvian Communist Party, and I suppose in Moscow also, promoted mostly Latvians, propagated Komsomol mostly among the Latvians, which is rather obvious, because Latvian young people, they were mostly anti-Soviet in 1940s and already in 50s. And there was no much need to persuade people who came from Russians or Ukrainians or Belarus, who came from the Soviet Union to join Komsomol, but it was a big task to persuade Latvians to join Komsomol. This task in 50s also was not quite solved. This problem of situation when almost all young people who reached the age of 14, 15 years, this is the age of Komsomol, joined Komsomol in school. This situation developed in 60s. In 50s, still, Latvians, despite the fact that this policy of attaching Latvians to Komsomol was quite successful, and Latvians constituted more than half of the Komsomol organization of Latvia, it didn't it was not grounded. It was not still was not strong. There were a lot of colchoses were not functional organizations. There were Komsomol. There were problems with higher educational establishments and so on. So why people joined Komsomol? Mostly, of course, because they were afraid that if they didn't, their career possibilities, their possibilities to get higher education, for example, or made some kind of social lift would be under threat. Of course, there were professions in which it was not of much importance. For example, on Latvian Agricultural Academy, people could study and became agronomes or other specialists, not being functional members. But for example, if you want to study law or something else, political history, for example, it have some importance. From this, and there was a kind of problem for Latvian Communist Party in 40s and 50s. Yes, attaching Latvians to Komsomol was important from ideological reasons. It was important in order to somehow to maintain control on youth. It was important in order to have some pool of potential apparatus people, nomenclatura people for party system, for other parts of for administrative bodies, for economic bodies, and so on. But at the same time, Latvians who came to Komsomol and people who became members of Latvian Komsomol, they also came from environment which often was a political, in the best case, and the worst case, anti-Soviet. And on one hand, they understood what people think, and they tried somehow to adjust their policies in order to attach Latvians to the Soviet power. On the other hand, there was a problem that really they could be infected with those not good feelings. Of course, people are changing their views. And for example, in 1963, there was a scandal in the Latvian Komsomol Central Committee because one of the instructors, very good one, by the way, it became known that in 40s, when he studied in school, he was a member of anti-Soviet group, for example. yes, one possibility is really is yes. In 40s he was anti-Soviet. In 50s or 60s he really became Soviet person. But anyway, the situation somehow signifies that there was some problem. And this is very much behind, also behind national communist purges in the Komsomol in 1959, 1960. Perhaps they followed also in 1961, but it is difficult to detect that. My research, in fact, it consists of two parts. One part is a study of Komsomol nomenclature in 50s, and I came to this in rather strange fashion. At first, I started to study how discotheques in 70s were introduced in Latvia. And this, by the way, Latvia, it seems that Latvia was the first one in the Soviet Union which discotheques were established. And this process was very much supported by Komsomol nomenclature. From this became interest to root and what kind of people were in Komsomol nomenclature. What kind of people, what was their background, their interests, their political views, if possible. And I, in 1921, in 2021, in 2020, I studied personal files of Komsomol nomenclature members, first secretaries and second secretaries of district and city committees and central committee workers. And now I start to study such personal files of Komsomol nomenclature in 50s. As regards period from 1949 to 1952 and 60s, there are also from there are only some 18 persons. So it's mostly it is about 50s. What is a kind of social portrait of this responsible Komsomol nomenclature member who eventually would become a member of party nomenclature, to have some leading posts in administrative bodies or economic bodies and so on. For the most part, those were men. They were of, they had middle technical education, for the most part, specialized education, but many of them already studied in some kind of higher education establishment. But in general, they were of rather average education. What is interesting, most part of them, as I already said, started in the Komsomol organization after 1949 and in rather advanced age. Typical age was 17 years on average. If you on average it was 20 years. A lot of them joined Komsomol in age of from 20 to 23 years. Very often it was in the army, because all men at this time, except those who studied in the university, had to fulfill compulsory army service, and often they became Komsomol activists in the army. What is also important is that Latvian, this Komsomol and what is also important, of course, in the context of Purges of national communists is that national communists had strong standing, standing in Komsomol, because being these back close through Minsk, they already were first secretaries of the Latvian Komsomol. Two of secretaries, Bleiere and Tkach, they could be considered rather as pro-Moscow and anti-national communist first secretaries. But at the moment of Purges, the first secretary was Latvian, and he was photo. And in fact, all Komsomol nomenclatura members purged in 1959-1960. We can divide in three groups. One group are people who were considered to be close to tuberculosis or Pinxis or somebody else from purged national communists, from national communists who were purged at the July 1959 plenary meeting of the Central Committee. Or they were considered to be infected with nationals. But there was a problem, because if we look at speeches of Ruskulis or other people, we couldn't find any evidence of this. And this was also admitted, as I would say a bit later, also by Pelship. The other group were people who were against voting. On September 22, on this group, except Ruskulis, in this group, we can say that in this group we can say that former second secretary of Komsomol, Herbert Walters, who is in July 1959 worked at Central Committee of the party, and also Konrad Sondors, who was the first secretary of Prigge City Committee, could be considered belonging to this group. Or probably also the second secretary, Jānis Francis. The second group are people who voted against Nikolai Karpov, who was sent in September 1959 to Riga to become the second secretary of Komsomol. And this group was quite, I suppose it was quite considerable, but we can detect only some people whose dismissal from Komsomol nomenclatura ranks was more or less directly connected to this issue. And the third group are Komsomol press managers, Latvian press managers, because Russian press, which was represented by one newspaper, Sovetskaya Молодежь, it was very, very loyal to Moscow. But Latvian press, it tried to be interesting to Latvian news, and so it was under constant criticism by conservative members of Latvian Communist Party. And it was there were two. One newspaper was Podlovnya, and the second newspaper was the newspaper review Liesma, the Flame. The Flame, Liesma newspaper Yoram, he was dismissed only in 1960. I suppose because he was Russian and by nationality, and so he was. It was more difficult to see him to be Herbert's Lopez. And it's August from editor of Podlovnya. And the real case was voting against Nikolai Karpov, because all Central Committee of the Komsomol, majority of members of the Central Committee of Komsomol at first voted against him. There was a big problem, because it was announced that there should be a break. This break was for 2 hours, and for 2 hours, Berlusconi, who was later dismissed as National Communist, he persuaded the members of Central Committee to vote for Karpov. What was interesting? They just didn't want against Karpov. They proposed alternative candidate. They said, yes, of course, we think yes too. We should have a Russian as the second secretary, but why not a local Russian? And they proposed the second secretary of Prigge City Committee, Anatoly Raskolov. By passport, he was Belarus. But this is of least significance in this case. And they almost succeed. But Krumich persuaded to vote for Karpov. And afterwards, but not immediately, but sometime later, a lot of dismissals started. Some dismissals were under pretext that people are transferred to another job. And such dismissals among first and second secretaries, members of the Central Committee, there were around 7 or 8 cases. So only in one case, in 2 cases, in cases of Sondors and the first secretary of the City Committee, Emil Arais, in those cases, it was admitted that it is because they were against Karpov's. But in Arais' case, there was a kind of detective plot, because perhaps this was not enough to dismiss him. So at first, for example, some report cards of Komsomol members vanished from the Bleiere City Committee. Учетные карточки in Russian. And so Arais was not able to ensure that secrecy regime is maintained in this committee, or he is not able to fulfill his obligations and so on. Of course, this plenary meeting of September 22, of course, showed very well for the Purges and other anti-battlerists that there is not good response. So on October 9, there was a meeting of Komsomol activists in which Purges made a big speech. And there is some citation from his speech, which I suppose shows very well his demagogical qualities. Because Purges did maintain that those people who were dismissed already and who are going to be dismissed, that they are agents of backlaw. No, but perhaps they are somehow infected by nationalism. Somehow имелись одинаковые настроения. They had similar mood, and so on and so on. And of course, this meeting was Russian comrades became the most ardent critics of nationalism in Komsomol. For example, Belov, who was the editor of Sovetskaya Молодежь, he also, especially he in more detail spoke about this Kharkov's elections and about people who, for example, that they are promoting Latvians to Komsomol and so on and so on. So I have to finish my paper, of course, but anyway, as we speak about purges, we can't say strictly what was amount of these purges, but these purges were more visible than in many other spheres or organizations in Latvia after July 1959. And they really formed a new kind of Komsomol nomenclatura, which became effective in 60s and 70s, but I can't say that this nomenclatura was very loyal to the Soviet power. Also, it had its twists and moods and so on. But as they spoke a bit different language and they experienced this big trauma of 1959 and 1960. Thank you.
Very much for that. So we'll be moving on now to our second presenter, who is Professor William Prigge. And the title of Professor Prigge's paper today is The Latvian Purges and the Fate of Two Moldavian Secretaries, Dmitrii, Tkach and Evgheni. William Prigge is a professor of history at the South Dakota State University. He specializes in the periphery of the Soviet Union. His early research focused on the purge of Latvian national communists under Khrushchev. Those findings were published in his 2015 book, Bear Slayers, Rise and Fall of the Latvian National Communists. Recently, his focus has shifted to the Moldavian SSR. He's recently completed 4 months of research in Moldovan state archives on a Fulbright scholarship, where he studied the causes of changes in the party leadership from 1959 to 1961, and the degree to which that was impacted by events in so
and I think I'm going to just sort of stay where I am, and I hate to say it, but read what I want to say, because I'm really worried about my 20 minutes here. And I have some slides that I would like to present if I have time towards the end here. And so with that, and I hope my presentation doesn't seem too disjointed to you, because I have sort of a couple of themes that I'm looking at. One is I'm interested to know what the impact of the purges in Latvia were on another republic, in this case, Moldova. How did it impact at sort of the grassroots level the issues in Moldova? And then I'm also very much interested in the leadership issues, changes going on in 1958, 1959, 1960, the organizational department, Shalepen and others, and how this relates to Latvia, how it relates to Moldova, and to what degrees are there connections. And then I have a third part, which is some of the data that I want to show on my slides, which I collected when the archives were closed and there was coronavirus, and I went through and I gathered just turnover rates for each of the different republics, their central committees, because I'm interested not just in top leadership changes during this period, but also interested to know how deep those changes go within the party itself. And the numbers mean nothing to me as they relate to these individual republics. They may mean more to you, but I just think that they're interesting to look at. It might be of use to other people. So with that, I'll go ahead and start with my reading here. When I saw many of you last in Uppsala, I had by that time demonstrated that the end of Bessarabianization within Moldova was part of a union-wide movement that was directly linked to the Latvian purges at the earlier date of September 1959, rather than being a uniquely Moldavian issue caused by the growing strain between USSR and Romania. 60s. Also, I previously showed the turnover rates in the Moldavian SSR from 1956 to 1986. And here now, today, I've expanded this to all of the republics. And I will show those slides to you at the end if I have time. While I have no particular insights outside of Moldova, I believe that it's worth looking at not only how widespread leadership changes were within the Soviet Union from 1958 to 62, but also how deep the changes went. I was also of the belief that the primary cause of the leadership changes within Moldavia was as much about removing dead wood or the non-performers within the party as it was about nationalism. And maybe just as a side note, one of the ways that I think about this is what are the different ways that people associate themselves? And I think along national lines is one of the ways that people associate themselves, but it's not the only way. And as Daina was saying, that this war generation was, to me, very interesting as well. And I think that another way that people can associate themselves is by their wartime experience. And it's just about this time as we get to 58 to 62 that generation is beginning to go down, and that post-war generation is starting to come of age. And so I see this very much as a generational struggle between, say, war veterans and non-war veterans, as with other things. And so my recent trip to the Moldovan archives has reinforced this position with some added nuances in the case of Dmitrii Tkach and Evgheni Postovoi. And there we do get some glimpses into nationalism as sort of a continued issue within Moldova, but maybe not as we might always imagine it. It's certainly not completely comparable to what we see within Latvia. Moreover, that Ivan Bodil's appointment as second secretary, if not first secretary, was the result of this need. That is to deal or cope with the problem of this dead wood or non-performers within the party. I was ambivalent about labeling Bodyal a Brezhnev protege who replaced Khrushchev's man Zinovy Serdyuk, largely because of the hostility Bodyal had towards Brezhnev in his memoirs and the warm words he had for Serdyuk. At that time, I was not certain why Serdyuk was removed. I was and am curious to know more about the role of Shelepin in this transition. For this presentation, I'm drawing particularly on Mike Loder's work on the events of 1959, as well as Saulius Grigkauskas' research on second secretaries to help contextualize my own findings and to discuss questions that I still have. An interview this fall with Moldavian First Secretary Petru Luchinsky offered insights into the fate of Serdyuk. In 1961, Luchinsky was young and not yet in the top echelon, but nevertheless well connected. He stated that in 1961, Nikita Sergeyevich, and these are his words, by 1961, Nikita Sergeyevich wanted to change personnel again, starting in Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan. So too was Serdyuk. He was ultimately was elected first deputy chairman of the party control committee. This position was high, but he never, neither before nor after, gave a photo of himself to the press. Eventually, when the leadership of the Central Committee was published, there appeared a photo of Serdyuk to show somehow that he had in fact advanced. Luchinsky went on to say, before that, the organizational department gave instructions. They themselves suggested that it was necessary in Moldova to think about the fact that national cadres should be Moldovans, and thus they began to search. Second secretaries were usually from Moscow, but here the situation was such that if Bodyal, and by passport he was Moldovan, was eventually to be elected first secretary, that it would be good for him to get some experience first as a second secretary. Okay, so those are his words. Now back to my words. First, Luchinsky is asserting that Serdyuk was kicked upstairs, that is, demoted through promotion, and not even worthy of the customary photograph that is associated with being placed in a new position. This oversight was soon corrected with the Central Committee photograph. What is interesting about Luchinsky's statements is that, unprompted, he recognized 1961 to be a period of union-wide turnover. The fact that he ascribed the turnover to Khrushchev does not demonstrate that it was Khrushchev who initiated all instances. Instead, it could just as easily be a general assumption on the part of Luchinsky, who never had a relationship with Khrushchev. In fact, Luchinsky goes on later to state that the initiative for a new first secretary and second secretary came from the organizational department. Whether Bodyal was truly Moldovan is debated. His grandfather originally migrated from Bessarabia to southern Ukraine. Most historians considered Bodyal alien and Russified, only speaking Romanian with difficulty. However, in Luchinsky's opinion, and Luchinsky himself is an ethnic Moldovan, the reason why the organizational department selected Bodyal was that Moscow considered him Moldovan, and having somebody of the titular nationality was important. It suggests that the organizational department wanted to see more representation of local nationalities, if only by appearance, in leadership positions, particularly first secretary. And that this comports with what Dr. Grigkauskas' conclusions on the role of each secretary were. But the fact that they used the position of second secretary as training for first secretary implies a certain flexibility and willingness to apply the Ukrainian approach to second secretary rather than the viceroy model of second secretary found in other republics. Nevertheless, after Boudil's appointment to first secretary, the traditional viceroy model returned. Perhaps Boudil represented both. He was a Ukrainian with some Moldovan ancestry. Now I just kind of want to bring Latvia into this a little bit more with some of these leadership changes. So to briefly broaden this talk to the entire Soviet Union, where I still have questions related to Dr. Grigkaus's work, is if within the Baltics, the basic form of second secretary was instituted in 1955, that is, meaning the use of a Russian or Ukrainian as second secretary, who permitted the use of a Latvian as second secretary, those Krumich, and why? That may help to further explain decisions made in Moldavia, especially a return to the Russian or Ukrainian second secretary because of disappointment with Prigge. So returning them back to Moldova, who then was behind the leadership changes in Moldova, and are they linked to changes in Latvia? Historians have generally linked Boudil's rise to patronage coming from Brezhnev. Regarding who was behind Boudil's appointment, Luchinsky was asked specifically, particularly if it was Shelepin. Luchinsky's recollections were clear and insistent. And so these are Luchinsky's words. Boudil's appointment was justified in all ways possible. But there was another person who had prospects, and in some documents, the one intended instead of Boudil, Vasily Gavrilovich Buga. Buga had good connections in Moscow, particularly with Semichastny and Shelepin. Boudil knew this and disliked Buga. Then Buga was sent to Moscow to the KGB. Buga was one of the people who had prospects, and those people who also had prospects followed him. So back to my words. Instead, Luchinsky credits Brezhnev as the decider because of the time Boudil spent in Brezhnev's office during his period in Moldova when his future wife worked for Brezhnev. And this is sort of the traditional understanding of why it is that Boudil received his position. And so Vladimir Semichastny, in his own memoirs, likewise attributes Boudil's rise to Brezhnev's affinity for Boudil's wife. Considering the closeness of Semichastny to Shelepin, this would seem to again favor Brezhnev. While recognizing the likelihood of Brezhnev's patronage to Boudil, Shelepin's influence in the governing of the Republic needs to be more thoroughly examined. Looking comparatively at Moldova, Latvia, and the organizational department in the winter and spring of 1958, these are critical months. Shelepin was appointed to the organizational department in April. The same month, Krumich was officially made second secretary of Latvia. That June, it was Boudil's first months out of party school, serving as an instructor for the organizational department. And Mike, you may have already spoken to this in your article at the end of sort of Communism with the Human Face. I didn't get a chance to review that again. But was Krumich's selection in 1958 a remarkable event? And if so, was it the result of Shelepin's arrival, or was the decision made before and Shelepin simply needed to live with it? So this is a big question that I have right now. I cannot tell from the literature I've examined thus far. In Boudil's memoirs, he recounts that Shelepin was scouting for talented young professionals from the republics and recognized Boudil's potential after he graduated from higher party school in June of 1958. So Boudil himself in his memoirs almost seems to be crediting Shelepin more than Semichastny does. And so Boudil did say that he relied on Shelepin in later years for helping to remove a problem some second secretary. And he also said he would always turn to people like Shelepin. He would never go to Brezhnev. So now kind of continuing on with this ripple effect into how did the purges affect Moldova, I want to look at the case of Dmitrii Tkach and Evgheni Postovoi. The Moldavian SSR, like Latvia, had true manifestations of nationalism that would clearly be problematic for any Soviet leader. Bessarabians came to dominate the writer union. The primary mouthpiece was Dmitrii, headed by the writer George Venue. Another enclave of nationalist sentiment was in higher education, particularly in the pedagogical institutes. In September of 1959, in direct response to the Latvian purges, the primary issues included whether the Moldavian language was its own unique language, or basically Romanian, and that there were unhealthy tendencies to focus on 19th century Romanian classics rather than Soviet Moldavian writers, and that a university professor who had inscribed in a notebook in Romanian long live the nation rather than workers of the world unite. In the September plenum put into motion a reaction and a counter-reaction that reveals new sources of power and influence. Dmitrii Tkach, as the secretary who oversaw the Ministry of Culture, was quietly removed in January 1960 for being too passive in his attempts to control manifestations of nationalism. His replacement was a larger-than-life dynamo named Evgheni Postovoi. Young and gregarious, Postovoi's stance was forward-leaning. Luchinsky wistfully recalled that the two secretaries. Tkach was very peaceable. He was more into fishing. On Postovoi, I recall him from my school days. I was a delegate at the Youth Congress. He spoke. He was young and everything that one could want in a secretary. He held the world in his hands, and there would be no deviations from internationalism. End of quote. Postovoi was going to be the antithesis of Tkach. Where Tkach had failed, Postovoi would succeed brilliantly, making his mark, and the path to first secretary and beyond would be wide open. And the new secretary did not hesitate to involve himself in all matters, particularly in culture. A film director once wryly quipped, "Do you know who runs ideology in Moldavia? A police officer," sort of literally Postovoi. Postovoi would fall spectacularly. Within 2 years of his appointment, he was a shadow of his former self and ostracized from the inner circle of the party. Soon Luchinsky, who had admired him so much as a schoolboy, would now become his boss. He was dead by 50 years old. Postovoi replaced Tkach in January 1960. Odiel replaced Serduk in May 1961. And in the midst of this transition, things came to a head for Postovoi. The incident related to the content of a movie script in which Postovoi was requesting alterations. The head of the Minister of Culture, Artyom Lazarev, was as well as the head of the Moldavian Writers Union, Andrei Lupin, were not necessarily natural allies, but they were in this instance. While historians have frequently understood the left bank as Russified Moldavians, this study takes a different position. Just to save on time, I want to say that there are, in a sense, two different types of nationalities within Moldavia. There are what I would call Moldavian nationalists, and there are sort of coming from the left bank, and then there are maybe more pro-Romanian nationalists. But again, I don't necessarily see these as two of the same thing. One is sort of centered out of the pedagogical institutes, the Ministry of Culture. The other one is more with the Writers Union. But let me kind of skip past some of this so I can keep on with the story here. The Writers Union and the Ministry of Culture had contacts in Moscow. A complaint letter was sent to the CPSUCC, unknown to Postovoi. 2 members were invited to Moldova to investigate the matter further. Lazarev and the two representatives from Moscow came unannounced to Postovoi's office and requested an immediate meeting. Outraged, Postovoi lost his cool and exploded at the three visitors. And so, including one statement regarding the party's control of culture. We will squeeze until the blood flows. In the midst of this, Lazarev offered his resignation in protest. It was not accepted. And the Secretariat of the CPSCC requested that the Moldavian CP investigate the matter. The investigation findings were discussed in the Bureau that July. A few statements from that meeting illuminate challenges that leadership faced as well as strategies various factions employed to even the field. While generally sympathetic to Postovoi's uniquely difficult position of managing creative activity, the most common comments related to his overreaction. It seemed he was an activist to the point of complete alienation and breakdown. Quote, "You have lost contact with your departments. You cannot cover everything yourself without people." That's my last page. This is more than a problem with a single secretary. The investigation reveals core problems of the party itself. Before the arrival of Postovoi, the creative intelligentsia felt themselves at ease, to some extent worked without parameters. No one disturbed them. Elements of nationalist character appeared in art, literature, and the work of individual institutions. It is clear that some people did not like the harsher, more qualified way of posing questions. Quote, the newly arrived secretary then remarked, our propaganda cannot be based only on shouting. We need to raise people up to carry out this work. A shout from above will not do anything but alienate the cadres of the intelligentsia from the party organization, from the Central Committee, end quote. This point, in my opinion, is important because it demonstrates the party cannot rule successfully by force alone. It requires consent. The key to consent was popularity. The party was not popular. Creative artists were. In this case, we see that latent power being actualized against Postovoi with remarkable effect. One bureau member scolded Postovoi for walking into a trap laid by the intelligentsia. What then were the strategies employed? First was the threat of resignation, which Lazarev used directly. Resignation equals the withdrawal of support and thus a delegitimization. But Lupin also claimed that he wished to retire for health reasons, but he would remain active for years thereafter, sort of again a threat. The second strategy was the anonymous letter writing campaign. Postovoi was targeted in at least two additional anonymous letters beyond the initial communication reached Moscow in April 1961. One was addressed to Khrushchev directly, and the second to the CPSU-CC Secretariat. The second letter spawned an entire investigation that lasted until the summer of 1962. Postovoi was not found guilty of the charges. However, according to Luchinsky, Bodyl did not have the full confidence of Moscow in the early years as first secretary. Even if the secretary found the charges to be baseless, the mere fact that they were called upon to investigate was going outside of the chain of command, humiliating Bodyl, and represented unrest rather than order. The splatter got on Bodyl as well at a vulnerable time in his career. It's little wonder that he came down hard on Postovoi so quickly in July 1961 Bureau meeting. The years 1958 to 62 represent some turning point. It's not simply a reaction to localism divided along national lines, but a generational divide. Veterans of the Second World War versus their children. And while localism was not tolerated, the need for local buy-in was firmly recognized and promoted. And it looks like no time for slides.
With two rich, nuanced papers, I'm under strict instructions from Mike to take groups of questions rather than individual ones. Given that we're still at the beginning of the conference, could I just ask everyone, when you ask a question, to introduce yourselves to the rest of the group? So, do we have any questions?
So Susanne Schattenberg from Bremen. And I have one question to Daina and one to William. And I'm not a specialist on Latvian history. I just was wondering, those who entered the Komsomol, did they somehow adopt at least the Bolshevik speaking and try to dress and fashion their thoughts and needs in the communist language, or did they stay totally alienated? So I think you said one became totally Soviet. So how was this process, or was it rather an exclusion and rare example? So I'm interested how these people grew or resisted within the Komsomol institution, how much the institution did infect the individuals, if this is possible to say at all. And to William, first a comment, I also read the Baudio memoirs, and my impression was always that it's a post-fact interpretation, and that he was indeed a client of Brezhnev, but he was quite disappointed that Brezhnev did not support Moldova more. I think it's in his book that he expected much more to be protected, to get resources, to be within the attention of Moscow, but he didn't get anything. So yeah, and my question is, I also, or I think it's quite obvious that there was a union-wide turnover of first secretaries around 59 to 61, and so do you have an idea what was the overall aim of it, or the whole strategy? Because I'm personally just guessing what it was. I mean, Khrushchev was so successfully defended in '57, and most of his followers, and I think also historians, said that this was the basis of his power, or the local or republic secretary, and it was a big mistake that he then got rid of them, and that was a major part of why he was then ousted in '64. So you explained it on the national level, but maybe it's still worth to look on the union level.
Okay, so that I can comply with Mike's orders, are there any other questions we can take as a group?
Hey, Robert Hornsby, University of Leeds. So I've got a question for Daina. My voice is already giving way. I'm speaking this afternoon. It strikes me that the Republican Komsomol Central Committee, they kind of have two bosses. They have the Republican Party Central Committee and also the all-union Komsomol Central Committee in Moscow. How much tension, particularly during the national communism period in Latvia, have you found between orders coming from the Komsomol Central Committee in Moscow and from the Party Central Committee in Riga, and who wins in these, as and when there is tension between the two?
Yeah, I think perhaps we can take questions. So, I'd like to respond to those two questions.
Yes. As regards Komsomol and Soviet language, of course, Komsomol in general, it was one of its tasks was to teach young people proper language, proper ideological language, and the second task was to find people who can be part of Soviet nomenclatura, as I already told, the party nomenclatura and so there was, and even if people who started who were Komsomol activists in school or in institute or university or at working place, of course they had to learn how to explain things in proper Soviet language. So it was a mechanism of Sovietization, indeed. On the other hand, there was a problem that people, for example, like Ruskulis, Walters, and other people, they were people who really believed in Soviet ideology. But this discrepancy was not because not between the ideological language and the real thoughts and the real language, but the difference was between the understanding that something is wrong with this ideological language and with Soviet politics. That this politics should be adjusted to what people in Latvia really want. I suppose that this conflict was very much, it was essence of this national communism question in Latvia on the whole. On the other hand, after national communist purges, starting with 60s and 70s, and it is consistent, it is not only Latvian problem, it is a problem of the Soviet system, and it is described by Tkach very well. It is a problem that if in 50s you can see by speeches and so on of communist Komsomol nomenclature people and so on, that often they still the language is not so Soviet in the sense that they are not always speaking right way and proper phrases and so on. But now you see in 60s and especially in 70s that they have learned this proper language, but those are just words. They don't believe. The real deeds and the words, they are different. Those are different things, and they understand it very well. And even they are moving from their ideological phrases and this ideological Soviet speak, and but at the same time somehow they believe in the system. There is a problem that if you are in the system long enough, you start to adapt to the system. Its values became your values to some extent, even if you are critical to some aspects or so. This washing out of real ideological commitment is visible from starting from 60s up to 80s. The second question was about art. Yes, it's very hard to say what Moscow said. What was Moscow Komsomol Central Committee directions different from those directions which came from Moscow Party Central Committee and Presidium and Khrushchev? I suppose not. There's a problem. Maybe some clues could be found in Moscow archives. In Latvian archives, it's very difficult to find such clues. But Belche and his people after July 1959 plenary meeting, they understood well if from Moscow comes idea that the secretary should be Russian and sent from Moscow, then it should be done. So there is no choice, no other possibilities. if Komsomol Central Committee doesn't understand it, Komsomol secretaries and other people doesn't understand it, so they were punished for this. Slowly, with different excuses, not immediately, but they were punished.
Yeah, so maybe why the changes in this 1958 to 62. I would see this, a big reason for it as again, this is the time that post-war generation is coming of age, and they stand in very stark contrast to the generation of wartime veterans. And maybe one of the ways that I might characterize the generational difference is that earlier generation was almost ad hoc. That is, that it was just after the war, you had to get somebody to fill these positions, and you're grabbing whoever you can to do this. And a lot of times it's army friends naming army friends as to who should be appointed where. And the whole thing had just a sort of ad hoc feeling to it. And then I feel like there is some kind of change happening, and I think it's emanating from the organizational department. And I feel like this is coming from Shalepen. And that the time for ad hoc is over. That the Soviet Union has fully matured to the point where we can start to rationalize the system further. And I feel like that's a common thread. If you were to follow Shalepen into, say, the KGB, he sees himself very distant from the former type of KGB, or the former names of it. And this is going to be sort of a new way, and it's rationalized and logical. And that I feel like this is something that he was trying to bring into Republican leadership at this time as well, rationalizing the system. And these current leaders are not performers. And if we bring in this young, vital, and then I would even say from the local talent within the republic. So part of the maturation is you can have true representation from the Soviet Union of all the different nationalities and all of the different flavors and colors that represents. Now, whether that goes all the way towards second secretary, that's kind of a different question. But part of what I keep wondering about too is Shalepen and Semichastny. We always imagine them as almost like blood brothers. And I keep wondering how close does Shalepen's beliefs relate to Semichastny's beliefs? Because, and correct me, Celius, if I'm wrong in this, but I got the impression from Semichastny's memoirs that he is very much of this viceroy model when he is second secretary, and that you should respect the Russian and speak Russian when you're in the presence of Russian. He wasn't about to learn the local language. And Khrushchev almost respected the national minorities more than Semichastny did in that instance. But I wonder, I keep wondering if that's Shalepen's beliefs also, possibly, probably, but I don't know for sure. And that in terms of Brezhnev, that here's something else that I think, that just because you are the patron of somebody does not automatically mean that you share their beliefs exactly. And it could be, as somebody like Semichastny would say in his memoirs, the reason why Bodyal was promoted was Brezhnev liked Bodyal's wife. And what if it's that shallow of a reason for promoting somebody, and it has nothing to do with Bodyal's actual ideological views? And could it be that while Bodyal benefited from Brezhnev, his ideological beliefs were much more closely aligned with Semichastny, and Shelepin. And I think that would sort of explain a lot of these differences that we see as negative views that he has of Brezhnev. Because in my opinion, what does Brezhnev represent? He represents crude patriotism. He represents ad hoc decisions. Leave it to somebody else to make the decisions. I don't want to know the details. Promoting friends for all sorts of just friendly reasons. And I think Dr. Kasha could speak to this as well, because he wrote an actual paper on Brezhnev's relation to Moldova. But in his article, he talks about all of the goodies that Moldova would receive because of this connection with Brezhnev. Maybe not the connection between Brezhnev and Bodyal, but the connection between Brezhnev and Bodyal's wife. But again, I see this as crude patronism, and that it represents the lack of order and rationalism that say Shelepin was.
Great, okay, thanks. We actually have a number of questions now, and so that we can remember exactly what was asked, I'm going to divide them into two batches. I'm going to start off with Saulius and Thomas. So Saulius.
Yeah, Saulius Grybkauskas from Latvian Institute of History, and I like how William pronounced my surname. So yeah, so my question, perhaps comment, will follow the last question, Rob's question about this center, this Republic National, Republic Communist, and perhaps not question, but more comment, because as I see from documents from Estonia and Lithuania, so Komsomol was like in the front, like a avant-garde, and always Communist Party and local nomenclature tried first, like laboratory for them, just to check with Moscow how Moscow will react to these Komsomol steps, and if it agrees, so we can use it for national communism. Yes, so it's like debates, like negotiation. So, but I see from your Daina presentation that the Latvian Komsomol stood like behind of National Communist Party, and only in 1959 they introduced this idea to move to fire Kharkov from the position. So and my idea is not just guess, just revision. So what if Komsomol would more support the national communists? So as case, perhaps the purge will be not so hard. Perhaps it would implement, impact these purges, this situation, these moves in 1959. So what would be your suggestion about that?
So Thomas.
Yeah, well, I would like Thomas Segal from Lund University. I would like to comment on the second paper because I think the logic of the post-57 development is pretty generational, as you mentioned now, because after 57, when the anti-party group was, so what I found in archives was a deliberate tendency of Khrushchev, not Shelepin, not these small people, but to replace the leadership. Who could replace them? It was the Komsomol group. Okay, so he deliberately took people from Komsomol. So Shelepin, in my position, in my eyes, was not an independent actor. Komsomol as such was not independent actor because in 1958, for example, Semichastny made a big speech where he denounced Pasternak. That's why the speech was famous. But if you read the whole story, then it is like replacing Stalin by Khrushchev. So he did not even de-Stalinize Komsomol. Yeah. 7 Komsomol leaders were killed during the purges, and he didn't mention any of them. Okay, so it was very pro-Khrushchev. So I would say it was Khrushchev who determined the policy, and then when he was the leader of the department within the Central Committee, there are interesting papers suggesting replacing local secretaries and party secretaries by Komsomol members. Okay, I can give you some later some references if you want. So that's, I think, the basic logic in generations. at that time, and that was a counter-reaction in the Politburo 59-60, when Zhelepin even was against his will, and without Khrushchev knowing about that, appointed the party was in Leningrad. And it was very strange because he was expelled from the center.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have some details about that if you want, and I also heard some explanation from Zemichasny, so I can then answer.
Okay, we've got a number of questions. If I can ask you to keep your responses brief.
So this question is difficult to answer because I don't think that Latvian Komsomol somewhere was behind development of party. But I think it was Komsomol always was a kind of reflection of party. In Latvian case too, because already Latvians were second secretaries after 1953. If in party there was period of Kashnikov and so on, so several attempts from Moscow to install Moscow's emissary as a second secretary. It's strange thing, but perhaps there was no attempt by Moscow to install Moscow emissary as a Komsomol second secretary after 1953, when Shaposhnikov was taken back to Moscow. So why it happened? It's interesting thing, but I suppose it needs further research. I suppose that in Latvian case also there is a problem. They had in the party central committee, they had an impression that Khrushchev is favorable towards new generation. And so somehow, I suppose one explanation for the situation could be that really Moscow somehow tolerated because those young people from Komsomol nomenclatura, they were expected to be a kind of basis for power basis for Khrushchev and so on. So, but this is just one explanation. I'm not sure that is quite right. It needs further research.
Well, and I probably don't have much of a answer just to follow up on Thomas's point, kind of trying to understand and establish how much people were free agents under Khrushchev versus following his leadership is a fascinating question, one I'm deeply interested in.
Great. Okay, we've got a batch of 4 comments and questions. So Jeremy, Alex, Mike, and then Igor at the very, and I think Igor, it's a comment, is it you want to make? So perhaps Igor, if you could start off with your comment, and then Igor, please keep it brief.
State University National Archives. First of all, like Daina, all the carrying from the third class, it's good to know national cards, but not because they are only due to the nationality. If you delete their class, you can find that sort of language, not the speaking, but the letters. It was a kind of standard everywhere you can find it. Very interesting way. So just for food for thought. Will, Body, I'm very glad that you coming with new thoughts and out of your archival trip in the last 4 years. First, I think there are 2 periods in Portugal's long 19 years. It's our Brezhnev. Yes. 68 is the turning point, I think, and a little bit before. And I think it's connected to the way, of course, also in terms of comparison. Petroshelist in Ukraine dealt with Prague Spring impact on Russia and how body dealt. I think this is essential. And you can see before and after his style of addressing to Moscow is very different. Before 68 is kind of humble, I would like to. 68 after, he's very, very arrogant. I'm not thinking, I kind of strongly recommend, and yeah, he's very proud of himself. He's kind of, and the second Postovoi, just an invitation to look very critically at the archival materials. Postovoi in the documents, he is very aggressive. He's rather a Russian chauvinist, according to the stenograms minutes. In reality, he was patronizing. He was one of the leader of the National Congress, and I agree with him. He was from Transnistria, but he is really kind of nationalist, pro-Romanian, So just this remark, very important. It's not enough to look at the documents. You should talk to somebody. You should look in the memoirs, but basically to talk to somebody. Yeah. Thanks.
Jeremy Smith at University. I'll just ask a question since we're short of time. So, is in these appointments, decision making, is there any role for public opinion, popularity, legitimacy? There are several points in the talk which made me think about it. So, is it all just this manoeuvring at the top, or I mean, beyond the nationality of the candidate, do things like wartime record matter? Do things like prior achievements which might establish some recognition of the public? Does it ever come into these equations at all?
So, Alex, I have in a way a related question, which is probably a primer for the breakfast on Friday as much as was a question for this panel. But my question is, and this is something I'm struggling with myself, whether the notion of intergenerational conflict, which we use in Soviet studies and Russian studies, is a viable and stable concept, because it seems to me that we use it in different ways. We use it to refer to demographic differences, people generation little people at different ages. But we also tend to use it in relation to ideas and concepts such as rationality versus romanticism, although in fact these ideas don't pertain to one generation in particular. These ideas are kind of constantly reiterated. Khrushchev is a promoter of rationality and rational governance. He is. I mean, that's his big passion. Yeah. It's bananas, but that's what he's on about. Yeah. And then the third way that is often used or overlaps is this idea of institutional struggle and people within different institutions, different power bases having conflicts. So that's my overarching question, stroke comment, stroke observation. Is generational conflict a stable and useful concept that we should keep using, or do we actually need a more complex paradigm?
Mike. I'll be very quick. So Daina, it is very interesting. You did hint at right at the end of the paper. How deep do you think that the purge of the Komsomol went? And also, I mean, how rooted do you think national communism was in the Komsomol? It's interesting that you mentioned about Gorlizki's removal, and that it was, and if I remember his personnel file, it's actually it's cooked up. The reason is to do with like a drunken brawl or something, if I remember correctly. His removal, because you mentioned that there was no evidence of nationalist activity. And then with Will, I think it's very interesting what you're saying. I mean, this is my wheelhouse, so I'm delighted that you're talking about it, about Sevichastny and Chilevin's role in Bologna becoming the secretary. That's very interesting to me. and of course, it's very unusual for a second secretary to be promoted to become a first secretary like that. And it's good for my paper. And I think that the remarks that you're making about having interviewed Lushchini, I think that's very interesting where you're getting this from. So, so my question is whether there was, just to confirm, and I think there's no nationalism stated for Sir Duke's removal, hence it's being kicked upstairs, right? I think that's important to understand. And with regard to, and I am delighted that we are coming up with these questions about this turnover of the first secretaries. And I can promise you, Susanna, you're going to get a good paper from me tomorrow on that very topic. So, yeah.
Right, so if I could ask you to respond to the question and to wrap up as well. Absolutely, start with you, Daina.
As regards generational conflict, and I try to guess your question. And of course, one of conflicts which led to purges of Latvian national communists was generational conflict in the Latvian Communist Party leadership. It was it is obvious, at least well known, even Converse in 58 or 57 complained to Khrushchev that the younger generation is pushing out old people and so on. But this generational conflict was also to some extent ideological conflict, because people, younger people were from different backgrounds than those older people. Because party nomenclature was mostly non-Latvian, or Latvians were so-called Latvians from Russia. And they had different experience and different attitudes towards Soviet language and Soviet nomenclature, and Soviet politics in general. Very often, not always, but very often. As regards younger generation, Komsomol, the problem is that Komsomol career as a role is very short, not more than 10 years. It is preparation for something else, which will be afterwards. And taking into account composition of Latvian Komsomol nomenclature in 50s, in which local Latvians dominated absolutely, and also non-Latvians, for the most part, they were local Russians, local Belarusians, local Poles. After 1959 purges became changes which are very obvious in 70s. In 70s we have rural districts in which still Latvians dominate, and we have big cities in which Latvians are minority, and we have central committee in which Latvians are minority, which are big cities and central committee are mostly populated by nomenclature, which has more or less same pedigree as regards their ethnicity, their education, and so on and so on. So this change is really very radical. We don't know what would happen if there was no 1959. Perhaps Latvian nomenclature would develop in entirely different direction. Could it develop? Could the Soviet system allow to develop in this direction? It is also a question. I suppose not. It was inevitable. It was Latvian developments in 50s. It was a kind of really, it was a strict absolutely unacceptable from the Soviet system. So, it was imperial system which could not allow to have some with a strongly centralized system which could not allow to have some kind of autonomy or some kind of like Chechnya in today's Russia, some kind of some local arrangement different from other republics.
Just 2 minutes here and I can wrap up. Maybe first to Mike's question, because it's my understanding that you found a document in which it has Serduk, maybe in 65 or something, that he's demoted or removed with the charge of nationalism. And I keep kind of going through in my mind how to understand that, because he's clearly not sort of these two nationalist types that I identified in Moldova. He would never be a part of either of those camps. He's kind of this coming in almost like a viceroy, maybe from Ukraine. So the charge of nationalism on the face seems strange, but maybe a way that it could be understood, because there it is in the documents. Why is it there that way? Perhaps the charge against Serduk in that 65 document would be somewhat akin to this Dmitrii Tkach, that he was supposed to be minding the store, as we say. Somebody's supposed to be watching the kids, and you were asleep at the switch. You weren't watching the children as you were supposed to, and now look at the chaos that they have created. And that's your charge, is that you were not sort of being vigilant enough. So that's the best way that I might be able to reconcile that document with what it is that I'm seeing. And then maybe to Jeremy's point, this is a question that is one of the most fascinating questions to me, of how much was the public used in this process as another source of asymmetrical power. And I think in Latvia, with something like Bear Klaus's newspaper, Riga's Balls, it is direct. And he is trying to tap into the demos to get power from them to do what it is that he wants to do in Latvia. And what I see as I'm exploring this, what happens to Postovoi, and maybe also to go to your point, Igor, that maybe he's being unfairly charged with these things, but even Bodio is charging him with these things. Why? Because it is getting hot. It is getting dangerous for these leaders to support Postovoi. Why is it getting so hot and dangerous to support Postovoi? Because you are losing support from the Writers' Union, from the Ministry of Culture, the one group, the groups that are actually popular with the people. And they desperately needed that popularity, which again, in an indirect way, goes to what you're saying with how it is that and on the point of define, is it a useful paradigm with the generations? I think so much always requires on the caveats that go along with that definition, and to really be sort of precise in how in what context are you defining it, what way are you attempting to use this concept of generational struggle, and then maybe if you give it that proper definition, then it can hold its space. So.
Right. Okay. So it's time. Want to say something?
No, it's break time.
Okay, so I think it's time for us, in Mike's words, to refuel on sugar and caffeine. But before we do that, I'd like to ask you to join me in showing our appreciation for two really engrossing papers. Thank you very much.